Welcome to the Explainer. Have you ever looked at a poem and just kind of wondered, why is it shaped exactly like that? Like, why are some poems these rigid, perfect little boxes of text, while others just seem to wander freely all the way down the page? Well, today we're going to look at poetry in a completely different way. I want you to think of a poet as an architect, and the poem as their building. Just like architects use blueprints to design houses or massive skyscrapers, poets use very specific structures to build their meaning. And once that structure is totally built, they get to decorate it with incredibly vivid emotional language. Let's get started and crack the code on how these poetic blueprints actually work. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover our explainer objective, exploring poetic forms, analyzing poetic imagery, a really cool model called the porcupine sonnet, a quick misconception check, and finally a concept recap. Kicking things off with Section 1, our explainer objective. So what's our goal here? By the end of our time together, you're going to be able to easily recognize the distinct characteristics of a variety of poetry forms. We're talking about the sonnet, ballad, ode, elegy, concrete poetry, dramatic monologue, and free verse. But honestly, recognizing the blueprint is only half the job. We're also going to practice analyzing poetic imagery. We're essentially going to be looking at poetry as these structural blueprints filled with vivid, imaginative decorations. Moving right along to Section 2, exploring poetic forms. Let's start with, probably the most famous form out there, the sonnet. A sonnet is absolutely always a 14-line poem, but what's really fascinating is how the form shifts depending on the specific framework the poet goes with. For instance, if a poet uses the Italian or Petrarchan format, the blueprint gives you an 8-line section called an octet, which usually sets up a problem, followed by a 6-line section called a sestet. But if they use the Shakespearean format, they adapt that exact same blueprint into 3 4-line sections called quatrains, ending with a super punchy 2-line couplet. It's the exact same number of lines, but a completely different architectural flow. Next up, the ballad. Think of this as the ultimate storytelling blueprint. Historically, ballads were narrative songs passed down out loud from person to person. Because they literally had to be remembered and sung, their blueprint relies on a really predictable, steady ABCB rhyming pattern within 4-line stanzas. It's a form designed specifically to just keep a story moving forward. Now, unlike that storytelling bounce of the ballad, lyric poetry is all about diving deep into emotions. Take the ode, for example. An ode is a formal lyric poem meant to really celebrate a person, a place, or a concept. Conversely, we have the elegy, which is a lyric poem specifically designed to mourn someone who has passed away. So while elegies are somber and odes are meant to elevate their subject, both of them actually tend to be really flexible in their blueprints. They can vary a ton in their stanza form and line length, and they often just don't stick to a rigid rhyming scheme. Okay, here's where we look at forms that handle the rules completely differently. Let's look at blank verse first. Blank verse actually does have rules. It's heavily used in dramatic monologues, and while it doesn't rhyme, it strictly follows a rhythm called iambic pentameter. That means it has this steady, 10-syllable, heartbeat-like rhythm in every single line. Free verse, on the other hand, it completely embraces breaking the rules. It lacks a specific rhyme scheme entirely and doesn't care about strict syllable counts, which lets the poet just organically shape the poem line by line. And then, if a poet wants to just throw standard text out the window, they might use concrete poetry. That's where the words are physically arranged on the page to look exactly like the subject of the poem itself. How cool is that? All right, that brings us to Section 3, analyzing poetic imagery. So, what actually is imagery? It's not just, painting a pretty picture in your head. It actually does some really heavy lifting. Imagery is the bridge between the physical world and the abstract world. It's where poets take a physical, tangible detail, like something you can literally see, touch, or feel, and connect it directly to an abstract emotion, or some deeper reality that's just too hard to explain using regular, everyday words. Now, for Section 4, let's look at a model, the porcupine sonnet. Let's see this imagery stuff in action. The poet starts with this incredibly physical, grounded image. They write, sharp quills, words like sharp barbs. They're looking at a solitary porcupine and zooming right in on its absolute main defense mechanism. Notice how the poet takes those literal quills and maps them directly to human behavior. Step 1 is our physical image, the animal's sharp quills. Step 2 is the abstract action. A porcupine uses them to defend itself or attack when an enemy invades its space. The poet is brilliantly linking the animal's physical defenses to those defensive, barbed words that we humans use when our own emotional territory feels threatened. And then, whoa, look how the metaphor escalates into something deeply painful. The poet's notes say, "The angry heat of jealousy embeds them deeper under the skin, expanding them to make extraction almost impossible." Right here, the physical reality of how a porcupine's barbs literally expand from body heat is transformed into an abstract exploration of jealousy. So if we synthesize all of this together, that physical expansion of those sharp barbs represents exactly how jealous nocturnal thoughts seek us out. Ultimately, the imagery of a nocturnal animal's expanding quills just perfectly captures the inescapable, embedded pain of human jealousy. The imagery is doing all the heavy emotional work. Moving into Section 5, our misconception and knowledge check. Okay, people confuse the terms structure and form all the time, literally constantly. But as you can see on the slide, they are definitely not the same thing. Form is the literal shape on the page. It's the genre, like whether it's a sonnet or a ballad, and the actual physical organization of the stanzas. Structure, though, is the internal architecture of the ideas. It's how the narrative is ordered, where the themes shift, and how the speaker's voice develops from line 1 to the very end. Think of form as the outside shell, and structure as the internal scaffolding holding everything up. All right, let's do a quick knowledge check based on what we've covered today. Take a look at the question on the screen. Which specific poetic form utilizes 3 stanzas of 4 lines, followed by a concluding stanza of 2 lines? Take a quick second to think about it. If you guessed the Shakespearean sonnet, you hit the nail right on the head. Remember, Shakespeare adapted that older Petrarchan format into his own highly specific 14-line blueprint. And that allowed him to build his arguments over 3 distinct quatrains before delivering one final powerful punch in that closing couplet. And finally, Section 6, our concept recap. Let's bring it all together. Remember, mastering poetry really comes down to recognizing the specific blueprint a poet chose to use. Sonnets, ballads, odes, elegies, and dramatic monologues, they all have very specific architectural rules. Meanwhile, free verse and concrete poetry purposefully break those traditional rules for dramatic effect. And once you spot the form, you just have to look closely at how the poet's imagery connects those physical, tangible details to deep emotional realities. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought for your next reading assignment. How will recognizing the specific architectural blueprint of the very next poem you read completely change the way you experience its vivid imagery? Seriously, think about it. When you know the shape of the house, the decorations inside just make a whole lot more sense. Thanks so much for joining me today, and happy reading!